They say a single second can rewrite your entire existence, but I never expected my undoing to wear an expertly tailored, three-piece charcoal suit and hold a cheap, rhinestone hair clip in his bare, leather-gloved hand. My name is Valerie Clara, and until 6 o'clock this morning, my world was measured in the quiet, comforting routine of a corner pharmacy in a forgotten, rain-slicked pocket of Brooklyn, where the air always smelled of dried chamomile and the only noise was the rhythmic chime of the bell above the door. I was just an ordinary girl, a practical-minded resident surviving on black coffee and stubbornness, utterly convinced that if you minded your own business in New York City, it would mind its own. Then came last night's brutal November storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the streetlights into hazy smears of gold when the clock neared 2 in the morning. I was just reaching for the metal security shutter, eager to finally lock up and crawl into bed, when a sudden crushing weight slammed against the iron gate, forcing it back up with a horrific metal shriek. The metallic, unmistakable stench of copper and iron flooded the small entryway before a massive, towering figure collapsed forward, dragging the heavy door down behind him with a resounding thud. I gasped, slipping instantly into a medical headspace as I dropped to my knees beside the unconscious stranger. Under the flickering neon light, my breath caught in my throat. He was nearly 6 feet 2 inches tall, built with a lean, lethal grace that remained imposing even as he lay bleeding out on my linoleum floor. His face was sharp, chiseled like cold marble, completely free of scars but radiating an oppressive aura of sheer authority that made the room feel entirely too small. A dark crimson stain was rapidly blooming across his black silk shirt, bubbling from a ragged bullet graze right along his ribs. Every survival instinct honed by years of living in the city screamed at me to push him back into the alley and dial 911, but the Hippocratic oath and a sudden, inexplicable pull tied my hands to his side. It took every ounce of my strength to drag his dead weight into the small exam room in the back, the next 2 hours dissolving into a blur of torrential rain drumming against the glass and my own ragged breathing. I prepped the instruments, sterilized the wound, and began stitching the torn flesh with fingers that trembled but refused to fail. Throughout the entire agonizing process, he never uttered a single sound, his jaw merely tightening as he endured the raw pain in absolute, terrifying silence. The moment the final knot was tied, a broad, callous-roughened hand shot up, clamping around my wrist with a grip that wasn't painful, but completely non-negotiable. His smoke-gray eyes slowly opened, locking onto mine with a cold, piercing intensity that seemed to memorize every line of my face, marking me as the one person who had dared to touch him. On the wooden tray nearby, his discarded leather gloves and a platinum watch caught the dim light. Before I could even ask for a name, he released his hold, stood up with an effortless, predatory fluidity, threw his long black overcoat over his shoulders, and stepped back out into the downpour, vanishing into the night like a ghost. The only thing he took with him was the cheap hair clip I had dropped on the cot. I let out a long, shaky breath, leaning against the counter and whispering to the empty room that it was over, that I had just saved a random stranger and could now go back to my quiet life. I was so incredibly naive. I thought I had just treated a wound, completely unaware that I had just signed away my freedom to the Silent King. Exactly 4 hours later, a deep, synchronized roar of heavy engines shattered the morning quiet, making the floorboards of my apartment vibrate violently. I threw a sweater over my strawberry print pajamas, shoved my glasses onto my face, and rushed out onto the small iron balcony. The sight below made my heart completely stop. The narrow one-way street was entirely blocked by a flawless line of sleek, midnight black SUVs, looking absurdly out of place against the weathered brick buildings. But it was the men that made the air leave my lungs. 200 men. They stood shoulder to shoulder, lining both sides of the asphalt, dressed in identical, perfectly fitted black suits with their hands clasped formally in front of them. There was no shouting, no sirens, just a suffocating absolute silence that carried the crushing weight of supreme power. In the center of that terrifying quiet, the door of the lead vehicle opened. Vincent Cassano stepped out onto the gravel. The bleeding, vulnerable man from the storm was gone. In his place stood the undisputed ruler of the New York underworld, his dark hair immaculately styled, his presence commanding the entire street without a single word. He tilted his head back, those piercing gray eyes locking instantly onto me. In perfect unison, 200 men suddenly bowed their heads at a sharp, 90-degree angle, their voices echoing off the brick walls in a singular, deafening roar that sent a flock of birds scattering from the roof. "Good morning, Mrs. Cassano." I gripped the rusted railing, my mind spinning into pure chaos as I stared down at my pajamas, then back at the army of suits. Vincent slowly walked up the concrete steps of my pharmacy, halting just below my balcony. He slid his leather glove off with an elegant, practiced motion, revealing his strong knuckles, and opened his palm to reveal my cheap rhinestone clip sparkling in the early sun. His gaze remained fixed on mine, his voice low, quiet, yet vibrating with an authority that brooked no argument. "Valerie Clara, you saved my life. From this moment on, your life belongs under my protection, and no one walks down this street without my permission." I looked at the 200 loaded weapons standing guard below, realizing with a jolt of pure adrenaline that my quiet life was officially dead, and I had just been drafted into a dangerous, intoxicating world where the king refused to let me go. The deafening echo of 200 voices gradually faded into the crisp morning air, leaving a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. I remained frozen on my small iron balcony, my fingers digging into the cold, rusted metal railing as I stared down at the sea of black wool suits and the man who commanded them all. Vincent Cassano did not move. He simply stood at the base of my concrete steps, his smoke-gray eyes holding my gaze with the absolute certainty of a predator who had already mapped out every escape route. A sudden sharp gust of wind swept through the narrow Brooklyn alley, rustling the hem of my strawberry print pajama pants and forcing me out of my trance. I took a deep breath, trying to shove down the sheer panic threatening to choke me, and stepped away from the ledge to march down the interior stairwell. My fuzzy slippers slapped loudly against the wooden steps, a ridiculous contrast to the high-stakes drama waiting just beyond my door. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and swung the door open, immediately stepping backward to maintain at least 5 feet of distance between myself and the man who had bleeding on my floor just 4 hours ago. Vincent crossed the threshold without invitation, his imposing 6'2" frame instantly making the high ceilings of my pharmacy look claustrophobic. He looked entirely different from the vulnerable man I had patched up. His presence was commanding, a silent king who ruled through absolute intimidation. He closed the distance between us in 3 smooth, quiet strides, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the linoleum. He extended his right hand, tilting his palm to let the light catch the cheap rhinestone hair clip resting against his skin. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold leather of his glove as I snatched the clip back, my chin tilting upward defensively. "You have a very strange way of saying thank you, Mr. Cassano. People in this neighborhood use words, not a private militia that terrifies my elderly customers." Vincent did not blink, his sharp features remaining completely unreadable as he slowly slid his other glove off, revealing strong, immaculate hands that showed no sign of the violence he controlled. He leaned slightly forward, his voice a low, melodic purr that somehow carried perfectly despite its quiet volume. "The men are not here to terrify your neighbors, Valerie Clara. They are here because the people who tried to put a bullet in my ribs last night now know exactly whose roof I slept under." A cold shiver traced my spine, the reality of my situation crashing down as I realized my simple act of mercy had inadvertently tethered me to a monster. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, refusing to let him see the tremor in my hands. "I am a resident doctor, not a target. I fixed your wound, you survived, and now our transaction is complete. I want you and your army gone before the morning delivery trucks arrive." Vincent tilted his head, a ghost of a humorless smile touching the corner of his lips as he tucked his gloves into his coat pocket. He glanced around the quiet shop, his eyes lingering on the neat rows of amber medicine bottles and the scent of dried chamomile before returning to my face. "Nothing in New York is free, and a debt to the Cassano family is never ignored. Your quiet life ended the moment you chose to open that door at 2 in the morning, Valerie. From this moment on, you are the only variable I cannot control, which means you are the only asset I must protect at all costs." He turned on his heel with predatory fluidity, his long black overcoat sweeping behind him as he walked back toward the entrance. He stopped with his hand on the brass doorknob, looking back over his shoulder, his gray eyes darkening with an intense, possessive finality that left no room for negotiation. "Get dressed. My men will remain on this block, and by noon, your world will adapt to mine. whether you approve of it or not. The heavy brass latch clicked into place as the door swung shut, cutting off the sharp autumn draft but leaving the oppressive weight of Vincent Cassano's final words hanging in the stillness of the pharmacy. I stood completely motionless in the center of the linoleum floor, my knuckles turning white as I squeezed the cheap rhinestone hair clip inside my palm until the sharp edges dug into my skin. Outside the frosted glass display windows, the ominous silence of 200 men continued to strangle the neighborhood, a suffocating vacuum that made the distant rumble of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway sound like a far-off whisper. I forced my stiff legs to move, marching back up the narrow stairwell to my small apartment while my brain fired in a dozen different directions, trying to calculate how a single night of medical instinct could throw me into the crosshairs of a criminal empire. I ripped off my strawberry print pajamas and yanked on a pair of dark denim jeans, a thick cream-colored wool sweater, and my broken-in leather boots, dressing like a woman preparing for a physical confrontation rather than a standard 12-hour hospital shift. Shoving my stethoscope, medical penlight, and identification badge into my canvas tote bag, I caught my reflection in the vanity mirror and swallowed hard at the pale, wide-eyed girl staring back at me. Descending the stairs for the second time that morning, I flipped the open sign on the front door, determined to maintain a shred of normalcy even as 3 sleek black sport utility vehicles remained parked directly across the street, their engines idling with a low, menacing purr. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the true absurdity of Vincent's definition of withdrawal began to manifest. The massive crowd of suits had vanished from the asphalt, but they had not left. They had simply adapted, blending into the urban landscape with terrifying precision. A man with shoulders wider than a refrigerator and a hidden earpiece was currently pretending to sweep the sidewalk 2 doors down, while another individual in a pristine designer jacket sat on a concrete stoop across the street, staring intently at my entrance while turning the pages of a newspaper he had not flipped in an hour. When the bell above the door chimed, my hand flew to the counter, but it was only old Mr. Abernathy, a regular who lived at the end of the block, shuffling inside while looking nervously over his shoulder. He walked up to the prescription counter, his hands shaking slightly as he laid down his empty bottle for blood pressure medication. "Valerie, dear, there are some very intense-looking gentlemen standing near the subway entrance, and one of them practically escorted me across the intersection without saying a single word." I forced a warm, reassuring smile onto my face, reaching over the counter to pat his wrinkled hand while checking the label on the bottle. "Do not worry about them, Mr. Abernathy. It is just some overly aggressive corporate security for the new development down the street, so you are perfectly safe." I filled his prescription with practiced efficiency, but as I handed him the bag, my eyes drifted past his shoulder to the glass doors. Vincent's presence felt like an invisible wire wrapped tightly around the entire block, a possessive shield that felt less like protection and more like a beautifully constructed cage. By noon, a massive shadow fell across the threshold as the bell chimed once more, and a tall, impeccably dressed man with a severe scarless face and sharp gray eyes walked into the shop, holding a leather-bound folder in his large hand. Vincent did not look at the shelves or the medicine. His gaze locked onto my face with a terrifyingly calm intensity that made my breath catch. He stopped right before the counter, laying the folder down with a soft thud before sliding his silver watch out from under his cuff to check the time. "Your hospital shift begins in exactly 1 hour, Valerie Clara, and a car is waiting at the curb." I stood straight, crossing my arms over my chest to hide the sudden racing of my pulse. "I take the subway, Mr. Cassano. I do not need a driver, and I certainly do not need your men masquerading as neighborhood locals." Vincent leaned his hands on the wooden counter, bringing his face close enough that I could detect the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain on his wool coat. "The subway is an unacceptable security risk, and my men do not masquerade. They secure. You made yourself a part of my world when you stitched my flesh, and until the threat is neutralized, your routine belongs to me." The air between us grew so thick with tension that the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt like a physical vibration. I stood my ground behind the wooden counter, my hands flat against the polished surface as I glared into Vincent Cassano's unyielding smoke-gray eyes, utterly refusing to let him see the tremble in my knees. He did not blink, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the rows of amber medicine bottles while he waited for my compliance with the cold patience of a man who always got what he wanted. I snatched my canvas tote bag from the stool, slinging the strap over my shoulder before marching out from behind the counter to stand directly in front of him, our height difference forcing me to tilt my chin upward. "I am going to my shift, Mr. Cassano, because patients are actually waiting for me, but do not mistake my cooperation for submission. Your men stay outside the hospital gates, and you stay out of my way." Vincent merely turned on his heel with predatory fluidity, his long black overcoat sweeping against my legs as he led the way to the glass entrance. He opened the door, a heavy hand resting just above my waist without making actual contact, guiding me firmly toward the curb where a pristine midnight black town car was idling with a low menacing growl. The rear door was held open by a massive individual in an identical dark suit who bowed his head slightly as we approached, his eyes scanning the street with practiced paranoia. I slid into the leather interior, the scent of expensive sandalwood and fresh rain immediately enveloping me as Vincent climbed in right after, the heavy door shutting with a dense, soundproof thud that completely cut off the familiar sounds of Brooklyn. The drive toward Manhattan was a study in absolute stillness, the silent king sitting beside me without uttering a single syllable, while his fingers rhythmically tapped against his knee. I kept my face turned toward the window, watching the familiar brick buildings blur into the concrete expanse of the bridge, my mind frantically spinning as I tried to process how my ordinary life had vanished in less than 12 hours. When the vehicle finally pulled up to the emergency room ambulance bay, I did not wait for the driver. I grabbed the door handle and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, desperate to breathe something that did not smell like him. Vincent caught my wrist before I could take a single step away, his grip firm but careful, his thumb resting directly over my racing pulse as he looked out at the bustling hospital entrance. "My people are already inside, Valerie Clara. You will perform your duties, you will stay within the secure sectors, and you will not attempt to leave through the rear exits at the end of your shift." I yanked my hand back, my eyes flashing with a sudden spike of anger as I adjusted the strap of my bag. "This is a sanctuary for healing, not a crime scene, so tell your shadow army to blend in or I will have hospital security remove them myself." A ghost of a cold smile touched the corner of his chiseled lips as he leaned back into the leather seat, his eyes darkening with a possessive intensity that made my chest tighten. "Hospital security answers to the city, Valerie, and the city answers to me. Do your work, and I will be waiting right here when the sun goes down." The heavy snap of the town car door closing behind me signaled the start of the longest 12-hour shift of my medical career. I hurried through the automatic sliding glass doors of the emergency room, the familiar blast of sanitized air, and the frantic beeping of cardiac monitors instantly swallowing me whole. Shoving my canvas tote bag into a staff locker, I snapped a plastic identification badge onto my scrub top and immediately dove into the chaos of the afternoon rush. Yet, no matter how many lacerations I stitched or how many charts I reviewed, the invisible presence of Vincent Cassano lingered like a suffocating shroud over the entire hospital wing. Every time I glanced toward the waiting room, I spotted the subtle signs of his absolute control, a broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket casually leaning against the vending machines, his sharp eyes scanning the triage line, while another individual sat quietly near the ambulance bay, an unmistakable earpiece glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. My hands remained steady as I administered medications and spoke with patience, but my mind was a raging storm of anxiety, wondering how a simple act of late-night compassion had bound me to the most dangerous man in New York City. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the heavy double doors of the trauma bay burst open as paramedics wheeled in a victim from a multi-car accident on the expressway. I rushed forward, my stethoscope swinging against my chest as I took the lead, barking orders to the nursing staff and coordinating the stabilization of the patient with practiced efficiency. Amidst the shouting and the frantic rush of adrenaline, I happened to look up toward the observation window overlooking the bay and froze for a fraction of a second. Standing in the shadows of the upper corridor was Vincent, his chiseled face partially obscured by the darkness, his smoke-gray eyes locked onto me with an intense, unblinking focus that made my breath catch in my throat. He did not wave or acknowledge me. He simply watched my hands work, analyzing my movements with a possessive curiosity that sent a shiver straight down my spine. When my shift finally ended at 2 o'clock in the morning, my muscles ached with exhaustion, and my eyes burned from the lack of sleep. I walked out of the staff exit into the biting chill of the New York night, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my wool sweater as the automatic doors slid shut behind me. True to his terrifying promise, the sleek midnight black town car was idling right at the edge of the ambulance bay, its headlights cutting through the swirling mist. Vincent was already standing outside the rear door, his long black overcoat buttoned tightly against the wind, his hands encased in those familiar dark leather gloves. He stepped into my path as I approached the sidewalk, his towering 6'2" frame effectively blocking out the rest of the city. "You survived the night, Valerie Clara, but the danger outside these walls has only multiplied while you were treating the sick." I stopped directly in front of him, my chin tilting upward as I clutched my canvas bag tightly against my side, refusing to let him see how exhausted I truly was. "I am going home to my apartment, Mr. Cassano, and I am going to sleep in my own bed, without your little army standing watch outside my window." Vincent merely reached out, his gloved fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from my forehead, his touch surprisingly soft despite the lethal power he commanded. "The time for negotiations has passed, Valerie, because my people just intercepted a transmission from the rival faction, and your name was at the very top of their list." The chilling declaration seemed to solidify the icy New York air right in my lungs, the exhaustion of my 12-hour shift instantly evaporating under a fresh wave of adrenaline. I stared into Vincent Cassano's unblinking, smoke-gray eyes, my hands clenching into tight fists inside the pockets of my wool sweater, as the distant wail of a Manhattan siren echoed across the East River. He did not move a single muscle, his towering 6'2" frame shielding me from the biting wind with an absolute terrifying permanence that left no room for protest. I took a sharp step back, shaking my head as the sheer absurdity of the situation threatened to push me past my breaking point. "This is insane, Mr. Cassano. I am a resident doctor at a public hospital, not a chess piece in your underworld territory wars, and I refuse to let you dictate where I sleep tonight." Vincent merely opened the rear door of the idling town car, a subtle flick of his gloved wrist signaling the massive driver to step onto the sidewalk and scan the perimeter with sharp, hawkish intensity. He turned his gaze back to me, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper that somehow pierced right through the rumble of the nearby expressway. "Your refusal will not stop a bullet, Valerie Clara, and the people hunting me do not care about your medical credentials. You have exactly 30 seconds to get into this vehicle before I choose to carry you inside myself." The cold finality in his tone left no doubt that he meant every syllable, forcing me to swallow my pride and slide into the plush leather interior, the heavy door shutting with a dense, soundproof thud that completely isolated us from the rest of Brooklyn. The drive back to my pharmacy was an agonizing exercise in absolute silence, the silent king sitting perfectly still beside me while the amber glow of the streetlights rhythmically illuminated the sharp, chiseled contours of his face. When the vehicle finally pulled up to the curb of my corner building, I did not wait for his permission. I threw the door open and marched up the concrete steps, my boots clicking sharply against the stone as I unlocked the heavy deadbolt. Vincent crossed the threshold right behind me, his eyes instantly tracking the shadows of the alleyway before he closed the door and turned the iron security latch into place with a definitive click. I spun around to face him in the dim light of the shop, slinging my canvas tote bag onto the counter, while the scent of dried chamomile rose up to meet the expensive sandalwood radiating from his wool overcoat. "You said your men would leave if I cooperated, so order them to clear out. I cannot run a business tomorrow with 200 soldiers patrolling a quiet neighborhood block." Vincent slowly unbuttoned his coat, stepping close enough that I had to tilt my chin upward just to look into his severe, scarless face. "The 200 men are no longer on the asphalt, Valerie. They have adapted to your environment, but they will not leave until the threat to your life is entirely neutralized." I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, a bitter laugh escaping my lips as I gestured toward the darkened glass entrance. "Adapted? You mean they are hiding in the shadows of my neighborhood, turning my home into a target?" Vincent leaned his hands flat against the wooden counter, bringing his face mere inches from mine, his smoke-gray eyes darkening with a possessive, unyielding intensity. "They are turning this block into the safest perimeter in New York City, Valerie, and whether you approve of it or not, your survival now depends on my rules." The ticking of the vintage wall clock above the prescription counter felt like a countdown in the heavy stillness that followed his words. I stared at Vincent Cassano, my chest heaving beneath my wool sweater, as I tried to process the reality of being a target for a rival Mafia faction. He didn't offer a reassuring smile or empty promises. He merely stood there, an unyielding pillar of dark wool and tailored silk, his smoke-gray eyes watching me with the absolute certainty of a man who owned the city. I stepped backward, my hand blindly searching for the edge of the wooden counter until my fingers brushed against a glass jar of dried lavender, the familiar scent offering a fragile anchor to my sanity. My rules are very simple, Vincent. I do not belong in your world, and I will not let you turn my family's shop into a fortress of fear. Vincent slowly took off his silver watch, placing it onto the polished surface of the counter with a soft clink before sliding his hands into his trouser pockets, his towering 6'2" frame remaining completely relaxed. Your shop was a fortress the moment you used your hands to save my life, Valerie Clara. You do not understand the people who are coming for me, because they do not negotiate, and they certainly do not leave witnesses. A sudden, heavy thump against the side brick wall of the building shattered the conversation, followed by the muffled scuffle of footsteps in the narrow alleyway outside. My heart leaped into my throat, my instincts as a medical professional completely short-circuiting as I reached for my canvas tote bag, my eyes wide with terror. Vincent moved with the terrifying, silent speed of a predator, his long arm wrapping securely around my waist to pull me behind the heavy oak desk, while his other hand reached beneath his jacket. He didn't scream orders or panic. He merely shifted his weight, pressuring me down into the shadows of the counter while his gray eyes scanned the frosted glass display windows with absolute focus. Outside, the low hum of an engine roared to life, followed by the screech of tires peeling away from the curb, but the expected explosion of violence never came through the doors. Instead, the heavy iron latch of the back entrance clicked open, and the massive scarred lieutenant from the morning slipped inside, his breath ragged as he adjusted his black tie. The perimeter is entirely clear, boss. The scouts from the rival faction were neutralized before they could even step onto the concrete steps of the property. I shoved Vincent's arm away, scrambling up to my feet as a wave of intense anger and disappointment washed over my exhaustion. Neutralized? Is that what you call it when you bring your blood feuds to a place of healing, Vincent? I saved you because it was my duty, not so you could turn my neighborhood into a hunting ground. Vincent rose slowly, his sharp features tightening as he looked at the genuine disgust in my expression, a sudden flash of vulnerability crossing his smoke-gray eyes before disappearing beneath his cold mask. He didn't approach me. He simply stood in the center of the dim room, his hands hanging loosely at his sides while the silence of the shop grew unbearable. I have spent my entire life building an empire out of silence, Valerie, and I have never had to justify my actions to a single living soul. You can look at me with disappointment, you can hate the methods I use to keep the peace, but you will survive this night because my men are standing in the cold to ensure it. He turned away, his long overcoat sweeping behind him as he walked toward the front entrance, leaving me alone with the scent of chamomile and the echo of his footsteps. The front door did not slam, but the heavy click of the lock felt like a final stroke of a pen ending a chapter. I stood in the absolute silence of the dim pharmacy for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the edge of the wooden counter, while the scent of Vincent Cassano's expensive sandalwood slowly faded into the familiar aroma of dried lavender and chamomile. Looking down at the silver watch he had left behind on the polished wood surface, I felt a strange, suffocating mixture of anger, exhaustion, and an inexplicable ache in my chest. My mind replayed the look of raw, uncovered vulnerability that had flashed across his smoke-gray eyes right before he walked away. The silent king, a man who ruled millions through fear, looked completely broken by a single glance of my disappointment. Stepping out from behind the counter, I looked through the frosted glass display windows, watching the first white flakes of the season dance through the amber glow of the street lamps as a Brooklyn winter began to coat the pavement. Pulling my thick wool sweater tighter around my body, I unlocked the front door and stepped onto the concrete steps, the freezing air biting at my cheeks as my boots crunched softly against the fresh snow. Vincent was standing near the curb, his long black overcoat already dusted with white, his hands tucked deep into his pockets as he stared into the dark expanse of the empty street without his usual army of guards immediately visible. He did not turn around when the bell above the door chimed, but his shoulders visibly tensed, his breath forming a small pale cloud of mist in the midnight chill. I walked down the steps, stopping just 2 feet behind his towering 6'2" frame, my voice trembling slightly from the cold rather than the fear that usually accompanied his presence. "You left your watch on my counter, Vincent, and a man who controls an entire city cannot afford to lose track of time." Vincent slowly turned around, his chiseled face partially obscured by the swirling snow. His gray eyes locking onto mine with an intense, quiet gravity that made the rest of the world completely fade into nothingness. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I had to tilt my chin upward to maintain contact, his large hand coming out of his pocket to gently catch the edge of my knitted scarf. With surprising tenderness for fingers that held the fate of empires, he adjusted the wool fabric around my neck, his thumb brushing lightly against my frozen jawline. "Time has no meaning when my entire empire is resting on a knife's edge, Valerie Clara. And the only territory I care about securing right now is standing right in front of me." My breath hitched in my throat, my hands instinctively reaching out to grip the lapels of his dark coat for balance as the sheer intensity of his gaze threatened to pull me under. "I am a resident doctor, Vincent. My world is about healing, about saving lives, not about territorial lines and midnight skirmishes." Vincent tilted his head, his thumb tracing a slow, warm path along my cheekbone as the snow continued to fall around us, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to melt the ice between us. "You healed my flesh during that storm, Valerie. But you did something far more dangerous to my soul. You gave a tattered, tamenless monster something to lose. And now I am asking you if you have the courage to finish what you started, and heal the rest of my tattered existence." The cold winter wind seemed to stand completely still as his words hung in the quiet midnight air, the falling snowflakes coating the shoulders of his dark wool overcoat like a shroud of pure white. I looked into Vincent Cassano's smoke-gray eyes, my hands remaining tightly gripped around his lapels as the warmth from his leather-gloved fingers radiated against my freezing cheeks, melting the icy barrier I had tried so hard to build between our worlds. A profound, terrifying realization washed over me in that frozen moment. I was no longer just a resident doctor who had performed a late-night medical procedure, because my heart was beating in a dangerous, erratic rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. I slowly closed the 2 inches of distance left between us, my boots crunching softly on the snow as I stood on my tiptoes, tilting my face upward to meet his descent. Our lips met in a gentle, deliberate collision that sent a sudden jolt of electricity straight to my core, his strong arms immediately wrapping around my waist to lift me slightly off the concrete steps, pulling me into the solid, protective heat of his chest. It was a silent vow, an unyielding surrender under the amber glow of the Brooklyn street lamps, where the king of the underworld officially made me his absolute center. Vincent finally pulled back just a fraction of an inch, his breath mingling with mine in a soft cloud of silver mist, his forehead resting against mine while his fingers tangled gently into the knit fabric of my scarf. "From this very second, Valerie Clara, you are the only boundary I will never cross, and the only treasure I will tear this city apart to keep safe." I managed a soft, breathless smile, resting my hands against his broad chest, entirely convinced that the storm had passed and our story was finally moving into a beautiful, quiet dawn. A sharp, rhythmic beeping from the tactical radio hidden inside his lieutenant's jacket suddenly shattered the silence, the harsh static slicing through the romantic stillness of the block like a razor blade. The massive scarred man rushed forward from the shadows of the alleyway, his face completely pale under the streetlight as he tapped his earpiece, his eyes wide with a sudden, frantic panic that made my stomach instantly drop. Vincent let go of my waist, his entire posture freezing into a rigid, lethal stance as his smoke-gray eyes narrowed into slits, a chilling wave of pure gravity returning to his features. The lieutenant stopped right beside us, his voice trembling as he delivered the message, the words echoing loudly against the brick walls of my family's pharmacy. "Boss, we just cracked the encrypted phone from the rival faction's scout, the insider who sold your location during the late-night ambush. It is Valerie's uncle." The blood inside my veins turned into pure ice, my hands dropping from Vincent's coat as a suffocating wave of dizziness threatened to bring me to my knees on the snowy pavement. Vincent did not look back at me, his gaze locking onto the dark mouth of the alleyway while his leather gloves tightened into dense fists, his silent king persona enveloping him once more. "Secure the perimeter and bring the car around immediately." 200 men in dark wool suits seemed to materialize from the shadows of the block in a matter of seconds, their heavy shoes pounding against the concrete as they drew their weapons, forming an impenetrable human wall around my steps. Vincent stepped down toward the idling SUV, his long overcoat billowing behind him as the distant roar of unmarked engines began to echo from the end of the intersection, leaving me completely frozen in the center of his armed fortress, staring at the terrifying truth that my own blood had started this war.